At the height of the American newspaper age, a single man decided each morning what 40 million people would be frightened of, amused by, or outraged at before breakfast. He owned presses in New York and San Francisco and Chicago, Boston, and Los Angeles. He owned the magazines that told American women what to buy and the newsreels that told American men what they had just lived through. He collected cathedrals in crates. He built a castle on a Californian hill because there had never been one there before. There was almost nothing in the visible world he could not acquire. And yet the arrangement at the center of his own life was one that no amount of money ever resolved. It was simply divided, geographically, permanently, and with a kind of terrible politeness, between two women who spent a quarter of a century occupying opposite edges of the same continent. One of them lived in New York. She had the name, the sons, the family pew, and the legal signature that mattered. Her afternoons were spent in committee rooms, at the head of a fund that put milk into the hands of women who could not afford it. She was photographed in pearls and dark velvet, and the caption always read the same way: Mrs. William Randolph Hearst. Her name was Millicent. She had been born above the noise of a working New York, the daughter of a modest vaudeville performer, and she had first been seen by her future husband from the dark of a Broadway theater while she was still a girl on a stage bicycle. The other lived in California. She had the house on the hill with 100 rooms, the beach house with a marble pool, the film company built around her face, and, every day for more than 3 decades, the man himself. She was one of the finest comic actresses of the silent screen, and one of the most consistently underestimated, largely because the person who loved her insisted on casting her in costume dramas she was entirely wrong for. Her name was Marion. What follows is the story of those two lives running in parallel, the wife who would not sign the papers, and the star who never asked her to. It is a story about loyalty of two very different kinds, about money used quietly and money used loudly, about a film that destroyed a woman's reputation for 30 years, and about an afternoon in the late 1930s when the mistress rescued the fortune that the wife had declined to save. Subscribe for more documentaries on the great dynasties of old money. New episodes every week. Neither woman won. That is the first thing to understand. One kept the name and lost the marriage. The other kept the man and lost her reputation. Between them, they held every part of a life that no single person ever held whole. And when the end came, in the August heat of a Beverly Hills bedroom, one of them was in the room and was not permitted to stay, and the other was 3,000 miles away and arrived in time to walk slowly, in mourning black, around a copper casket that belonged, by law, entirely to her. In 1897, at the Herald Square Theater on Broadway, a musical comedy called The Girl from Paris was drawing crowds through a New York summer. Among the ensemble were two sisters billed, in the fashion of the moment, as bicycle girls, young performers who rode across the stage on machines that had become, in that decade, the great symbol of modern freedom for women. The elder was Anita. The younger was Millicent Veronica Wilson, born in New York on the 16th of July, 1882. Their father, George Wilson, was a vaudeville man of moderate success. Their mother was Hannah Murray Wilson. It was not a poor household in the desperate sense, but it was a household in which income depended on whether an audience turned up, and in which two daughters were sent out to earn from a very young age. The Wilson girls had grown up backstage. They knew the smell of gaslight and grease paint, the cold of unheated dressing rooms, the particular sound a house makes when it is half empty. In the audience that season, as he was in the audience of a great many New York theaters, sat a tall, oddly soft-spoken man of 34 with a fortune behind him and a newspaper war in front of him. William Randolph Hearst had been born in San Francisco on the 29th of April, 1863, the only child of a mining senator and a school teacher who had become one of the great philanthropists of the American West. He had been given the San Francisco Examiner by his father as a young man, had turned it into something loud and profitable, and had then come east to do the same to New York. By the time he began appearing at the Herald Square, he was already the most disliked and most imitated publisher in America. He was also, in the language of the day, a stage door Johnny. The chorus lines of Broadway were, for men of his class and generation, a recognized hunting ground, and nobody at the time pretended otherwise. What made the Wilson episode different was that it did not end when the run ended. The sources disagree on precisely how old Millicent was when he first noticed her. She was somewhere in her middle teens, and he was more than twice her age. What is documented is the shape of what followed. A courtship that lasted years rather than months, conducted with her elder sister Anita present as chaperone, and observed with mounting displeasure by the one person in the world whose opinion Hearst genuinely feared. Phoebe Apperson Hearst had begun life as a country school teacher in Missouri. By the 1890s, she was among the most influential women in California. A founder of institutions, a patron of the University of California, a collector, a builder. She had raised her son almost alone while his father chased silver across the West, and she had made him what he was. She did not want a chorus girl. The objection was not moral, it was categorical. In the social arithmetic of the period, a young woman who appeared on a stage for money existed in a separate class from the world Phoebe had spent 30 years entering. There were dynasties in New York, Astors, Vanderbilts, Belmonts, whose drawing rooms could be closed to a family for a generation over precisely such a marriage. Phoebe understood, better than her son did, that his political ambitions would be judged in those drawing rooms. Hearst waited her out. It took him 6 years. On the 28th of April, 1903, in New York, William Randolph Hearst married Millicent Veronica Wilson. He was 1 day short of 40. She was 20. They left immediately for Europe, where he did what he always did on the continent, which was to buy things at a rate that alarmed everyone around him. Phoebe did not come round quickly. What eventually softened her, according to the family record, was not persuasion but grandchildren. And there would be 5 of them. There is a temptation, looking back, to read the marriage of 1903 as a mistake concealing itself as a romance. The documents do not support that. For the first 2 decades it functioned, and it functioned in a very particular way, as a political partnership. Because in the spring of 1903, William Randolph Hearst did not primarily want to be a newspaper proprietor. He wanted to be President of the United States. That autumn, he took his seat in the House of Representatives, elected as a Democrat from a New York district. In 1904, he made a serious attempt at his party's presidential nomination and failed. In 1905, he ran for mayor of New York and lost by a margin narrow enough that he spent years insisting the count had been dishonest. In 1906, he ran for governor of New York and lost. In 1909, he ran for mayor again and lost again. 4 campaigns in 6 years, each one louder and more expensive than the last, each one ending with the same result. Through every one of them, the woman standing beside him on the platform was the former bicycle girl from Herald Square. And she was extraordinarily good at it. This is the part of Millicent Hearst that the later story tends to erase. She had been trained since childhood to hold a room, to be looked at, to project without appearing to project, to keep composure while something went wrong in the wings. Those are political skills. She had them before she had the money to use them. The children arrived in a rhythm that mapped almost exactly onto the campaigns. George was born in the spring of 1904 in Washington, while his father sat in Congress. William Jr. followed in January 1908. John came at the end of that decade. And in December 1915, there were twins, Randolph and David, 5 sons, no daughters. In a family with an empire to inherit, this was regarded at the time as a kind of dynastic triumph, and it altered Millicent's standing permanently. The chorus girl was now the mother of the Hearst heirs. Phoebe, who had refused to attend the wedding celebrations with any enthusiasm, became a devoted grandmother. Millicent, meanwhile, was building something of her own and building it in exactly the arena where her husband was failing. He could not persuade New York to elect him. She could persuade New York to give her money for causes. In 1915, she served on the New York State Commission for the Great Exposition held that year in San Francisco, acting as official hostess of the New York Pavilion, her husband's home city, her platform. When the United States entered the war 2 years later, the mayor of New York appointed her chairman of the Mayor's Committee of Women on National Defense. Under her, the committee ran a canteen for servicemen, staged patriotic rallies, organized entertainments, and distributed coal, milk, and ice to families who had none. She sat on committees to raise funds for the rebuilding of France and for the relief of French orphans. And then, in 1921, she founded the thing that outlasted everything else she did, the Free Milk Fund for Babies. It is a modest name for a large operation. For decades, the fund put milk into the hands of poor mothers across New York City, in the tenements of the Lower East Side and beyond, financed by an annual round of galas, benefit performances, and society luncheons that Millicent Hearst ran with the discipline of a campaign manager. Eleanor Roosevelt appeared at those events. So did most of political New York. In the depths of the Depression, the fund was for a certain number of families, the difference between one kind of childhood and another. There is a detail here worth holding on to, because it will matter later. Millicent Hearst's charity was public, organized, permanent, and attached to her name. It was also, in its way, an answer to Phoebe Apperson Hearst. The chorus girl had become a builder of institutions. There was another campaign running underneath all of this, and it was the longer one. The New York into which Millicent Wilson had married in 1903 did not welcome her. It could not entirely refuse her because she had married a great deal of money, but the old families of Fifth Avenue had spent a generation constructing a system precisely to keep out people whose origins were what hers were. Everyone knew where she had come from. Everyone knew what her father had done for a living. In the drawing rooms that mattered, a former performer was received with a courtesy carefully calibrated to be indistinguishable from a snub. Her response was to make herself indispensable. This is the pattern of her entire adult life, and it is visible from the very beginning. She did not attempt to be forgiven for her origins, and she never denied them. She simply built an operation that the city's grandest women wanted to be seen inside, a committee they wished to sit on, a gala they needed an invitation to, a cause it was socially useful to be photographed supporting. The women who would not have received her in 1905 were, by 1925, applying to serve on her boards. It was a slower revenge than her husband's, and considerably more effective. She raised the boys largely alone, in the practical sense, because their father was a man who worked 18 hours a day and then took a boat somewhere. They were brought up between the Riverside Drive apartment, the ranch at San Simeon in the years before the castle, and the long European journeys on which their father collected. The photographs from that period show 5 small boys in identical coats, standing in front of cathedrals, being educated by acquisition. What she gave them, according to everything they later said and did, was a fixed point. All 5 went into the family business. All 5 in adulthood arranged their lives so that their mother was never publicly humiliated by their father's second household, an arrangement they maintained with real delicacy for the whole of her life, and one that must have required, from men working under a father like that, a certain quiet courage. By the early 1920s, she was one of the most photographed hostesses in New York. Her husband was in California more and more of the year. Nobody at that point was writing about why. 6 years before the wedding at Herald Square, and a river away, another New York family was raising daughters who would go on the stage. Marion Cecilia Duras was born in Brooklyn on the 3rd of January, 1897, the youngest of 5 children. Her father, Bernard Duras, was a lawyer who would later sit as a New York City magistrate. Her mother was Rose Riley. The family was Irish, Catholic, respectable, and comfortable enough. A professional household in the Prospect Park district, not a theatrical one, which makes what happened next slightly unusual. There were 3 elder sisters, Rain, Ethel, and Rose. There had also been a brother, Charles, who did not live past 15. He drowned in 1906, and the family did not afterwards speak of it easily. All 4 sisters wanted the stage. The eldest went first, and the others followed, and at some point in their adolescence they made a decision that reads today like a small act of self-invention. Doris was a difficult name for a marquee. Walking near their home in Brooklyn, they passed a property agent's signboard bearing another name entirely, and took it. From that afternoon they were the Davies sisters. Marion was sent to be educated by nuns, the convent of the Sacred Heart at Hastings, and afterwards briefly a convent in France. She was not an academic child. She had, from her earliest years, a stutter, which would follow her for the whole of her life and which shaped a great deal of what she became. People who stammer often develop an extraordinary sensitivity to the rhythm of other people's speech. Comedians frequently come from precisely that background. Marion Davies grew into one of the sharpest mimics in America. She left school for the chorus line. Her stage debut is recorded at 13. By 1914, she was on Broadway in a musical called Chin Chin, and shortly afterwards she was in the Ziegfeld Follies, the most visible chorus in the country, in a shop window for exactly the kind of man who had once sat in the dark at the Herald Square. It is worth being precise about what the chorus line was because both women in this story came out of it, 20 years apart, and the modern imagination gets it wrong in both directions. It was not disgrace. Thousands of respectable New York girls went into it. The pay was better than a shop or a factory, the hours were tolerable, and for a family with more daughters than income, it was a rational decision. Marion Davies' father was a lawyer who would sit as a city magistrate. He did not send his daughters onto a stage out of desperation, but it was also not innocence, and everyone concerned knew it. The men who bought the front seats were, in a very substantial proportion, there to look at girls of 17. The great reviews of the period were organized around exactly that transaction and made no secret of it. A chorus girl in New York in the 1910s existed inside a structure in which the most reliable route out of the chorus was a wealthy man, and in which a young woman's professional future could be decided by who came backstage. That was the world in which Millicent Wilson met a publisher of 34 in the 1890s. It was the same world, essentially unchanged, in which Marion Davies met the same man 20 years later, at almost exactly the same age Millicent had been. He did not vary his method in 2 decades. Neither did the system that supplied it. She was not, however, waiting to be discovered. In 1917, at 20, Marion Davies co-wrote and starred in her own picture, Runaway Romany, directed by her brother-in-law, the theatrical producer George Lederer. That fact tends to be dropped from the popular version of her story, and it should not be. Before William Randolph Hearst ever put a dollar into her career, she had already written herself a leading role and got it made. The accounts differ as to precisely when the two of them met, and Marion's own memory of it was characteristically vague. What is certain is that by the closing years of the war they were involved, and that in 1918 he took formal control of her professional life. He was 55. She was 21. His wife was in New York, running a wartime committee. The company he built around her was called Cosmopolitan Pictures, and it was from the beginning an instrument of one man's taste rather than an assessment of one woman's talent. Hearst wanted her in velvet. He wanted plumed hats, throne rooms, staircases, and history, the kind of picture in which a young woman in a farthingale is mistaken for a commoner by a king. In 1922, he produced When Knighthood Was in Flower, a Tudor costume epic with a production cost of roughly $1.75 million, which made it the most expensive film yet made anywhere. It was followed by Little Old New York and by a run of similar productions, each mounted with a lavishness that had less to do with the box office than with a private conviction that she deserved to be seen in gold. The trouble was that Marion Davies was funny, not decoratively funny. Genuinely, structurally funny. A physical comedian with impeccable timing and a gift for impersonation that could stop a room. When the studios finally allowed her to do what she was built for, in pictures like The Patsy and Show People, both released in 1928, the result was some of the best comic screen acting of the decade. Audiences understood it immediately. Her lover, who controlled her career absolutely, never entirely did. And so the promotion began. Every Hearst newspaper in America reviewed her pictures. Every Hearst newsreel found her. Her name appeared in the gossip columns of a syndicate that reached tens of millions of readers, written by employees who understood exactly what was expected of them. Hearst reportedly spent $7 million establishing her as a star. It was the most generous thing he could have done, and it was the single most damaging. Because from that moment onward, nobody could tell, nobody can entirely tell, even now, where Marion Davies ended and the machinery began. Every good review was suspect. Every award, every ranking, every adoring paragraph carried the same silent asterisk. When she was excellent, it looked like propaganda. When she was miscast, it looked like proof. Then the pictures learned to talk, and everyone assumed it would finish her. The stutter had been with Marion Davies since childhood. In the silent era, it had been an irrelevance, and possibly an advantage. An actress who could not always trust her tongue learns to say everything with her face, and her face was one of the most eloquent in American cinema. Sound threatened to take that away. She was, by every account, frightened. She made the transition anyway. Her first talking picture came at the end of the 1920s, and she went on to work through the following decade opposite the biggest male stars of the period: Clark Gable twice, Bing Crosby, Gary Cooper. She was competent in sound, sometimes better than competent, and the stammer, which appeared reliably in private conversation, almost never appeared on a soundstage. Actors who worked with her described watching it vanish the moment the camera turned over. But something else was closing in, and it was not her voice. In the middle of the 1930s, the studio at which Cosmopolitan Productions were housed was preparing an adaptation of a celebrated stage play about the poet Elizabeth Barrett. Hearst wanted the part for Marion. The head of the studio, who had his own loyalties and his own view of what the picture required, gave it to another actress, the wife of his production chief. It was a straightforward piece of studio politics, and by the standards of the industry, it was not even especially cruel. Hearst's response was to move his entire film operation and his newspaper's attention to a rival studio across town. He did it for her. That was the reasoning, and there is no evidence it was anything else. But the effect, repeated in various forms across 2 decades, was to make Marion Davies into a permanent problem for every executive she worked with. An actress who could not simply be cast or not cast on the ordinary commercial grounds, because behind her stood a man capable of turning a national press against a studio over a supporting role. Nobody in that position is ever allowed a normal career. The parts that came after the move were thinner, the pictures made less. By the middle of the decade, she was being reviewed with a cruelty that had almost nothing to do with her performances and everything to do with the 15 years of manufactured praise that had preceded them. The Hollywood that surrounded her was not fooled about her personal qualities, at least. She was, by universal testimony across 4 decades, the best-liked woman in the film colony. Generous to crews, quietly paying medical bills for people she barely knew, funding the passage home of a forgotten actress who had ended up destitute in England, sending other people's children to school out of her own account. She kept no distance whatsoever. It is very difficult to find anyone who worked with her and disliked her. She was also, increasingly, the hostess of a court. The parties at San Simeon and later at the beach house in Santa Monica were the parties that mattered in California. Costume balls, weekend cruises, a guest list running from Charlie Chaplin to visiting British statesmen. Marion presided. Hearst, austere in his personal habits and famously strict about hard liquor under his own roof, watched from the edge with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his luck. And 3,000 miles away, in the Clarendon on Riverside Drive, his wife read about it in the society pages of her husband's own newspapers. In the middle of November 1924, a 280-foot yacht called the Oneida left San Pedro Harbor bound for San Diego, carrying one of the most consequential guest lists in the history of American gossip. The occasion was a birthday. Thomas Ince was one of the founding figures of the American film industry, the man who had effectively invented the studio production system, the shooting schedule, the continuity script, and the budget as instruments of manufacture. He was also, by that autumn, in financial difficulty, and he was hoping to conclude an arrangement that would bring Hearst's Cosmopolitan Productions onto his lot. He missed the sailing, he took a train down the coast, and joined the party the following morning. That night, the guests celebrated his birthday at dinner. Sometime afterwards, he became seriously unwell. He was taken off the yacht and brought ashore, and within a very few days, he died at his home in Benedict Canyon. His personal physician recorded heart failure. The district attorney in San Diego made inquiries and announced that there was nothing further to investigate. The body was cremated, as Ince and his wife had long intended it should be. Those are the documented facts, and they have never been overturned. What happened next belongs to a different category altogether. The Hearst paper's first accounts of Ince's death gave a version of events that did not match what other guests remembered. Rival papers noticed. Within weeks, a story was circulating through Hollywood in which the death aboard the Oneida had not been natural at all, and in which the silence of everyone present had been purchased. The tale, repeated in countless retellings ever since and eventually dramatized in films, holds that something occurred on that yacht which the most powerful newspaper proprietor in America was able to bury. Whether it happened this way, no document confirms, no inquest supported it, no participant ever produced evidence. Even the identity of the guest list varies between accounts, which is itself a warning about how much of the legend is reconstruction. What can be said with certainty is far more modest and far more interesting. The rumor attached itself permanently to Hearst and to Marion Davies, and it did so precisely because of what everyone in California already knew about the relationship at the center of that weekend, because that was the year the arrangement stopped being a private matter. Until the early 1920s, the affair had been conducted with the ordinary discretion of the period, known in the industry, unmentioned in print, invisible to the wider public. What changed was not any single revelation, but an accumulation. The yacht, the parties, the castle rising on the Californian hill, where Marion Davies acted as hostess in front of politicians, film stars, and visiting foreign dignitaries. A film company built openly around one actress, a newspaper empire promoting her without embarrassment. At some point, it ceased to be an open secret and became simply open. For Millicent Hearst in New York, this was a change of kind rather than of degree. A husband's affair could be absorbed. A husband's second household presiding over the family's most spectacular property in front of the international press could not. The date usually given for the separation is 1926, though the drift had begun earlier, and no formal announcement was ever made. There was no court, no filing, no statement. What there was instead was a decision, and it was hers. She would keep the marriage, the name, and the legal position. She would live in New York. She would raise the 5 sons, run her funds, hold her place in the society her mother-in-law had once feared she would embarrass. She would appear, when required, as Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, and she would appear with absolute composure, and she would not divorce him. That refusal is the hinge of the entire story, and it deserves to be understood without sentiment in either direction. It was not simply pride, though there was pride in it. Millicent Hearst was a Catholic woman of her generation for whom divorce carried a religious weight that no arrangement could lift. It was also a matter of standing. In the New York of the 1920s, a divorced woman lost a very great deal, and a divorced woman of theatrical origins lost more. And it was, unmistakably, a position of leverage, the one thing in the world her husband wanted that all his money could not buy. He never publicly asked her for it. She never publicly refused. And for the next quarter of a century, the most powerful publisher in America lived openly with a woman he could not marry, because his wife would not release him, and neither of them would say so out loud. An arrangement of that kind does not stay quiet by itself. It has to be maintained, and in this case it was maintained by the largest publicity apparatus in the world. The instrument was a small, round, relentlessly cheerful woman from Illinois named Luella Parsons, who had begun as a scenario writer, drifted into film journalism, and been picked up by the Hearst organization in the years after the war. By the 1930s, her column was carried in hundreds of newspapers and read by something in the order of 40 million people. She could make a career with a paragraph. She could end one with a sentence. What she was, functionally, was the arrangement's press office. Marion Davies appeared in that column as a great star and a great hostess. The parties were reported. The gowns were reported. The house on the beach was reported. What was never reported, not once in 3 decades, across the most gossip-hungry press in the world, was the plain fact of the situation, that the woman being described lived with a married man whose wife was 3,000 miles away. And the same silence ran in the other direction. Millicent Hearst appeared regularly in the same newspapers, opening a gala, chairing a fund, receiving a delegation, always as Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, always with the calm authority of a woman at the center of her own life. The 2 women were covered in the same publications, sometimes in the same week, and the coverage was arranged so that neither of them ever appeared to be standing anywhere near the other. It was not censorship in any formal sense. Nobody issued an instruction. It simply became understood, across an organization employing tens of thousands of people, that certain sentences were not written. The rival press was not so constrained, and the arrangement was an open joke in New York, in Chicago, and in London for 25 years. But the ordinary American reader, the reader who bought a Hearst paper in the morning and went to a Marion Davies picture on a Saturday, was told nothing. Millions of people watched her on a screen for 2 decades without ever being informed, by any newspaper they were likely to see, whose house she went home to. That protection had a cost, and Marion Davies paid it rather than he did. Because when a career is defended by an apparatus that size, every part of it becomes suspect. The good reviews, the awards, the box office, and eventually the woman herself. There was no way for her to be believed. The machinery designed to make her untouchable had also made her impossible to assess, and it left her without the one thing that might have protected her later, which was an independent reputation. 20 years afterwards, when a young director came to make a film about a newspaper king, the machinery would be turned against that film with everything it had, and the person destroyed by the collision would not be the newspaper king. By the end of the decade, the geography had hardened into something almost formal, and both women had a kingdom. Marion stood on a hill above the Pacific at San Simeon. Hearst had begun building it around 1919 on land his father had bought as a cattle ranch, working with Julia Morgan, the first woman licensed to practice architecture in California, and one of the most gifted American architects of her generation. They would work on it together for close to 28 years and never finish it. Cathedral ceilings arrived from Europe in crates. Roman sarcophagi were set into terraces. Whole monastic cloisters were shipped across an ocean and stored, some of them never unpacked. Marion Davies presided over the house as though she were its mistress in every sense the word allows, because in every functional sense she was. She organized the costume balls. She made the guest lists. She managed the fantastically complicated business of entertaining 40 people at a time who all wanted the host's attention. Guests recalled the strict rule about spirits, the single-week cocktail before dinner, the enormous refectory table with the paper napkins and the bottles of tomato ketchup set out among the tapestries. It was one of the strangest households in the world, and it ran, largely, on her charm. Then, at the end of the decade, she acquired a second one entirely of her own. On 5 acres of Santa Monica Beach, she built a house, designed initially by William Flannery, later extended with Julia Morgan's involvement, that eventually reached something in the region of 110 rooms, with a marble-decked saltwater swimming pool that ran almost to the tide line. It was called Ocean House. For 20 years, it was the most desirable address on the Californian coast, and it belonged to her. 3,000 miles away, Millicent had built her own. Her principal residence was a vast apartment in the Clarendon on Riverside Drive in Manhattan. 5 floors of a single building, a scale of city living that has essentially no modern equivalent. And in 1927, her husband bought her something more theatrical. On the north shore of Long Island at Sands Point stood a fantastical castle built a decade earlier for Alva Belmont, the formidable Vanderbilt divorcee turned suffrage campaigner. Hearst purchased it with the adjoining lighthouse land for $400,000. It was renamed for Joan of Arc, extended with 16 further rooms and a private cinema, and given to his wife as what she had described as a between-seasons home. Consider the arrangement from a sufficient distance, and its symmetry is almost architectural. He built a castle on the Pacific for the woman he lived with, and bought a castle on the Atlantic for the woman he was married to. Both were furnished from the same European buying sprees. Both were staffed on the same imperial scale. They were separated by the width of a continent, and they were never, at any point, occupied at the same time by both women. In the early years after the separation, Millicent still came west occasionally. In September 1929, when Winston Churchill visited San Simeon during his American tour, it was Mrs. Hearst who received him as hostess of the estate. The photographs from that visit show a woman entirely in command of the situation, standing in a house that in every practical sense had ceased to be hers. She stopped coming after that, more or less. In 1933, at the Long Island Castle, the Hearst held a dinner dance for something in the order of 2,000 guests, filling the great stone courtyard with the film industry, the newspaper industry, and a considerable proportion of the international social register. It was the last great night the house ever had. Within a decade, it would be surrendered to a bank against unpaid taxes, and shortly after the war, it was demolished. Houses were built on the site. The gatehouse survives. There is something in that trajectory that describes the whole period. Enormous expenditure, absolute confidence, and then a receding tide that took the buildings with it. But the two kingdoms were not only made of stone, each woman built something else during those same years. And it is here, more than anywhere, that the parallel between them becomes uncomfortable to look at directly. Millicent's Free Milk Fund grew through the 1920s and 30s into a permanent New York institution. It was run the way a serious operation is run: annual galas, benefit nights, a board, a reliable calendar of society obligations converted efficiently into cash. In the Depression years, the demand was overwhelming. Eleanor Roosevelt lent her presence. The New York papers, not only her husband's, covered the balls, and the coverage was the point, because coverage was what filled the accounts. In California, meanwhile, Marion Davies had discovered the same thing from a different direction. In the middle of the 1920s, she began supporting a small clinic in Sawtelle, a poor district on the western edge of Los Angeles, serving families who had no access to a doctor. She then did something more substantial. She bought a block of land on the site of a former dairy, hired the architect who had designed her beach house, and in 1928 opened a purpose-built children's clinic in the Spanish colonial style. Roughly $45,000 for the building alone, and something approaching $200,000 by the time the land and the equipment were counted. No fees were charged. The doctors gave their time. Any child under 16 in the surrounding districts whose family could not pay a physician could be treated there. In 1932, she formalized the arrangement as the Marion Davies Foundation. She had no children of her own that the world was permitted to know about. She had, by every account that survives, a particular tenderness toward other people's, and she directed a very substantial share of her personal fortune toward them for the rest of her life. Two women then, at opposite ends of a continent, both of them building organizations to keep poor children alive, both of them financing those organizations largely out of the same man's money and their own, and neither of them, so far as any surviving document shows, ever acknowledging the other's existence in public. The difference was in what the world did with it. Millicent's philanthropy became her identity. It was the reason her name appeared in print, and it insulated her. Marion's philanthropy was known in Los Angeles and almost nowhere else. In the national imagination, she remained the actress in the castle. What she did in Sawtelle was invisible, and remained invisible for the better part of a century. And then came the decade in which the money stopped. For most of his life, William Randolph Hearst had operated on a principle of magnificent indifference to arithmetic. He spent what he wished, borrowed against what he owned, and assumed the next year's revenue would cover the last year's enthusiasm. Through the 1920s, this worked. He was buying newspapers, radio stations, magazines, ranches, castles, tapestries, armor, whole rooms of European buildings, and the empire generated enough cash to carry the interest. The Depression removed the cash and left the interest. By the middle of the 1930s, the position had become genuinely dangerous. Advertising revenue had collapsed across the industry. The debts were enormous. Creditors who had spent 30 years extending courtesy to the most powerful publisher in America began to behave like creditors. Properties went. The Welsh castle he had bought in the 20s and lavishly restored was disposed of. Art was sold, in some cases at humiliating prices, in warehouses that the public was invited to walk through. Control of the corporation passed effectively into the hands of a conservation committee. For a period, the man who had decided what 40 million Americans read each morning was not permitted to sign his own checks. In New York, his wife watched the collapse and did not intervene. That is not a moral accusation. It is simply what the record shows. Millicent Hearst had her own resources and her own settlement, and she declined to put them into rescuing an empire that was, by that point, sustaining a household in California in which she had no part. What she did instead, in 1937, was ask for a divorce. After 11 years of refusal, she offered him the one thing he had wanted, and she named her price, a property settlement that included Cosmopolitan magazine, one of the most profitable titles in his portfolio, and the publication that carried the name of the film company he had built for Marion Davies. He would not agree. The negotiation collapsed. The marriage continued exactly as before, and neither of them ever raised the question again. In California at the same moment, Marion Davies did the opposite. The accounts vary in their details, as accounts of private transactions do, but they agree on the substance and they agree on the sum. She contacted her business people. She sold jewelry. She liquidated stocks and property. Within a few days, she assembled $1 million in cash, an extraordinary figure in 1937 at the bottom of a depression, and an even more extraordinary one when the person assembling it was a woman with no legal claim whatsoever on the man she was giving it to. She handed it over. According to what he later said, he told her he would make it up to her one day. It is worth pausing on the position she had put herself in. She had no marriage, therefore no marital property. She had no legal standing in his estate. She had no children, the world acknowledged. If he had died the following week, she would have had precisely what he chose to leave her and not a cent more, and she gave him $1 million anyway. She was also, in the same period, watching her own career end. Her last picture, Ever Since Eve, was released in 1937. She was 40 years old, in an industry that had already begun discarding actresses at 35, and she had spent 2 decades being cast in the wrong parts by a man who adored her. The transition to sound had gone better than she feared, given the stutter, but the roles had thinned, and the pictures had stopped making money. She retired. She said afterwards that she did it to look after him. The empire survived. It was reorganized, cut back, and slowly returned to profit through the 1940s. San Simeon was saved. Whether it would have been saved without that $1 million is not a question that can be answered with certainty, but every serious account of the period treats her intervention as material, and Hearst himself plainly regarded it as decisive. The wife had asked for a magazine. The mistress had written a check. 4 years later, a 25-year-old from Wisconsin made a film that decided how both women would be remembered. Orson Welles arrived in Hollywood in 1939 with a contract of unprecedented freedom and no film experience whatsoever. What he made with the screenwriter Herman Mankiewicz was the story of a newspaper proprietor of colossal wealth and colossal appetite who buys an opera career for a second wife with no voice, builds a half-finished pleasure palace in the American wilderness, fills it with crated European statuary, and dies inside it and alone among his possessions. Nobody involved ever formally conceded whose life it was. Nobody needed to. The trouble began in the first days of 1941, when the columnist Hedda Hopper was shown an unfinished print. Her rival, Luella Parsons, who wrote for the Hearst Syndicate and had built a national career on her proximity to its owner, saw it shortly afterwards and understood immediately what she was looking at. She went to her employer. What followed was the most concentrated exercise of private power in the history of the American film industry. Hearst's papers refused to carry advertising for the picture. They refused to list its showtimes. They refused for a period to mention its existence and let it be understood that they might take an interest in the private lives of studio executives who distributed it. There were threats of litigation. There were suggestions, passed upward inside the organization, that the director be investigated for his politics. An offer was reportedly made to buy the negative outright. The film opened on the 1st of May, 1941, to reviews of extraordinary enthusiasm. It then failed. Blocked out of a great many theaters, denied publicity across an enormous share of the American press, it closed its first run at a loss in the region of $150,000. It received 9 nominations at the following year's Academy Awards and won 1 for the screenplay, and the announcement of that single victory was met in the hall with audible booing. For 30 years afterwards, it was chiefly a curiosity. Then it came back, in Europe first, then on American television, and became, by common agreement, the most admired film ever made in the United States. And every one of those admirers met Marion Davies in the form of Susan Alexander Kane, talentless, drunk, kept, working a jigsaw puzzle in an enormous empty room while her husband's fortune rots around her. This was the injury, not the caricature of Hearst. He was a public man. He had spent 50 years making enemies. And the portrait, however cruel, was recognizably an argument about power. The injury was to a woman who was not a public man, who had never held office, who had been a genuinely gifted comedian, and whose name was now permanently attached to a fictional character created to demonstrate a rich man's vanity. Hearst is said to have been less enraged by his own portrait than by hers. The detail he could not forgive, according to those around him, was the drinking. It was not an invention, and it should be stated plainly and without relish, because it was the hardest part of her life. Marion Davies drank. She had begun in the Prohibition years when everyone in her world did, and by the late 1930s, with her career finished and her position permanently ambiguous, it had become a serious, invisible problem that she struggled with for the rest of her life. Friends protected her. Hearst tolerated it in a household where he permitted almost no spirits at all, which tells its own story about how much he loved her. She was frequently unwell, sometimes for long stretches, and increasingly unhappy behind the hospitality. What the film did was take the truest private difficulty of her life, strip it of every mitigating circumstance, and hand it to the 20th century as her definition. Wells, to his considerable credit, spent his later years attempting to correct it. He said repeatedly that Susan Alexander was not Marion Davies, that Davies had been a real artist whose talent Hearst's patronage had smothered rather than created, and he eventually wrote a foreword to her memoir saying so. In 1971, the critic Pauline Kael made the same argument at length in print, that Davies had been a leading lady of genuine standing who had never needed the promotional machinery she was buried under. By then, she had been dead for 10 years. The war years were, by a strange irony, the quietest and possibly the happiest of the whole arrangement. With the empire in convalescence and San Simeon expensive to run, Hearst and Marion Davies spent much of the period at Windtoon, a wooded estate on the McCloud River in Northern California, a cluster of Bavarian-style houses in a canyon of pine and river fog, an entirely different order of place from the palace on the coast. There were fewer guests. There was less spectacle. He was in his late 70s and then his 80s. She was in her 40s, out of pictures, and effectively his companion and nurse. Those who visited described something that reads, in the accounts, like an ordinary long marriage. Two people who read constantly, who talked about what they read, who watched films together in the evenings, who bickered comfortably. He was, by every report, entirely dependent on her presence. She had organized her life so completely around him that when a doctor's appointment took him away for a day, the household noticed. In New York, Millicent Hearst was doing what she had done for 20 years. The free milk fund continued. The galas continued. Her sons, now grown men with their own marriages and their own places in the corporation, moved between the two worlds and were, by all accounts, scrupulously careful with their mother's feelings. That care is documented, and it is one of the few tender details in the entire story. 5 men in early middle age, all of them working for their father, all of them managing the delicate business of never making their mother's position more humiliating than it already was. In 1947, the story left San Simeon for the last time. Hearst was 84, his heart was failing, and the ranch was too far from serious medicine. He came down to Beverly Hills, to a house on a quiet road, and never went back to the hill. He lived there for 4 more years, and Marion Davies lived there with him. Those 4 years are the part of the story that almost nobody tells, and they are the part that explains the rest of it. The house on the quiet Beverly Hills road was not a palace. It was a large, comfortable, unremarkable Californian residence of the kind a successful surgeon might own. And after San Simeon, it must have felt like the end of the world. There was no cathedral ceiling. There were no crated cloisters in the grounds. There was a bedroom, a nurse, a doctor's schedule, and an old man who had spent 60 years being the loudest voice in the country and who was now largely confined to one floor of a house that was not his. She organized her entire existence around it. She was 50 when they came down from the ranch and 54 when he died, and in those 4 years she went almost nowhere. Friends who called found her in the same rooms, doing the same things, watching the same films in the evenings, with a man whose hearing was failing. The Empire's executives came and went and dealt with her as a fixture of the household, which by then she was. She had been the most expensively promoted actress in America. She had been the hostess of the most photographed private house in the Western Hemisphere. She spent the last 4 years of the arrangement in a suburban bedroom in a city that had forgotten her professionally, keeping a dying man company. Whatever else the phrase "kept woman" was ever supposed to mean, it does not survive contact with that. On the 5th of November 1950, in that house, he did something that would detonate 10 months later. He called in lawyers and signed an agreement with her. On his death, she would become the sole voting trustee of the corporation that sat on top of the entire empire and would remain so for life. It was, in effect, control. She told no one. Then came the summer. He died on the morning of the 14th of August, 1951, in the Beverly Hills house, in his 89th year. She was not with him at the moment it happened. In the days beforehand, the house had filled with family, executives, doctors, and nurses, and she had grown extremely distressed at the noise and the crowding around a dying man. A doctor sedated her. She slept. By the time she woke, the body had been removed and taken north, and the men who had run the empire on his behalf had begun running it on their own. Within 20 minutes of the death, the corporation's chief operating officer had walked into the house and informed the staff and the nurses that they now worked for him. She said afterwards to a reporter that a possession of hers had been taken, that she had loved him for 32 years, that she had not been able to say goodbye. Whatever else can be said about the ambiguity of her position over 3 decades, on the morning of the 14th of August, it resolved itself with brutal clarity. She had no standing. She was not next of kin. She was not, in the eyes of the law, anything at all. The body was carried to San Francisco and lay in state in the Episcopal Cathedral on Nob Hill. The funeral was held on the 17th of August. The great copper casket was set in the chancel between crosses of white lilies. The Bishop of California read the service. The governor was there, in the industry, in the political class of 2 states, in the executives. And walking slowly around the casket in black was his widow, a woman who had been, as one account of that morning observed, almost a stranger to him for the last 29 years of his life. She had come from New York. She was 69 years old. She had been married to him for 48 years, separated for 25, and had refused to divorce him for every one of them. And now she stood at the front of the cathedral in the position that had been hers by law since 1903 and buried him. Marion Davies did not attend. She was not invited. She stayed in Beverly Hills with the blinds drawn in the house where he had died with his dachshund. She told a nurse that she had thought about going to church that morning and had decided to stay where she was, that he had known how she felt and she had known how he felt, and that was enough. A visiting newspaperman found her sitting in the half-dark, talking about better years and humming to herself. He was buried at Cypress Lawn, south of San Francisco, in the family mausoleum, beside his mother. The will was read, and it did what everyone expected. The fortune went to the widow, to the 5 sons, and to charitable trusts. The administration went to the sons and to a board of executives, most of whom were not family, and who assumed as a matter of course that the empire was now theirs to run. For a fortnight, Marion Davies said nothing and learned a great deal about who her friends were. The men who had spent 30 years seeking her goodwill discovered that they had urgent business elsewhere. Her name, which had appeared in the Hearst papers almost weekly for 3 decades, stopped appearing at all. Then Hedda Hopper, the rival of the columnist who had spent her career defending the empire, printed the story of the agreement signed in that Beverly Hills house the previous November. The effect was seismic. If the document held, the woman who had never been permitted to attend the funeral would control the voting stock of the holding company that sat above every newspaper, magazine, radio station, and film interest the family owned. She would appoint the officers. she would choose the directors. The sons would answer to her. The lawyers who had drafted it confirmed it. So did she. The estate's administrators, the fourth son among them, responded immediately and furiously in public, calling the agreement worthless. Privately, on a second reading, they became a great deal less certain. What followed was a month of negotiation conducted almost entirely out of sight, because neither side wanted the alternative, which was a courtroom in which every detail of 34 years would be examined by every newspaper in America that was not owned by the family. In November 1951, they settled. Marion Davies surrendered her rights under the trust agreement in full. In exchange, she was made a lifetime official consultant and advisor to the corporation on editorial policy at a salary of $1 a year. She was reported at the time to be worth in the region of $10 million in her own right, and she wanted no money. What she wanted was the thing the agreement had actually been about: acknowledgement and the ability to have her friends and her causes appear in print again. She had been handed control of one of the largest media empires on earth, and she gave it back to his children in under 3 months. It is one of the strangest transactions in American corporate history, and the most revealing thing in the entire story about what she actually valued. She had spent a lifetime being described as a kept woman. Presented with the opportunity to take everything, she took a title and a dollar. There was one more piece of theater that autumn, and it has puzzled people ever since. On the 31st of October, 1951, 11 weeks after the funeral she had not been allowed to attend, Marion Davies married a merchant marine officer named Horace Brown in Las Vegas. She had known him a matter of weeks. He was a large, loud, cheerful man from Virginia who bore, according to nearly everyone who saw them together, a marked resemblance to a younger William Randolph Hearst. The marriage was not a success. There were separations. She filed for divorce twice and withdrew both times. It lasted legally until the end of her life, and no biographer has ever produced a satisfying explanation for why she entered it, beyond the obvious one, that after 34 years she did not know how to be alone in a house, and that at 54 she wanted for the first time to be somebody's wife. She had the title now. It was simply the wrong name. The last decade was quieter than the 30 years that preceded it, and in some ways it was the most independent period of her adult life. The business instincts that Hollywood had always underestimated turned out to be considerable. She had been investing in Californian real estate since the 1920s, quietly and shrewdly, and she went on doing it. She backed a Broadway musical that ran for well over 500 performances and returned a handsome profit. She managed her own affairs, held her own counsel, and remained in a town that had largely forgotten her professionally, one of its more substantial private fortunes. She also gave the money away. In 1952, she made a gift of close to $2 million to establish a children's clinic at the University of California in Los Angeles. It was the largest single act of philanthropy of her life. It followed directly from the small Spanish colonial building she had put up in Sawtell a quarter of a century earlier, and it is the reason her name is still attached to a pediatric facility in that city today. Most of the people who pass it have no idea who she was. In the summer of 1960, when the Democratic National Convention came to Los Angeles, she turned her own house and the houses of her relatives over to the Kennedy family for the duration. She had known the father since the film industry's earliest days, and the son since he was a boy at San Simeon. It was the last public thing she did. She was already seriously ill. There was a malignant growth in her jaw, and that summer she had refused the surgery that was recommended for it. She appeared briefly on television that year, giving a tour of her Beverly Hills house, a heavy, tired, still enormously charming woman of 63, being funny about a life that had ended 9 years earlier. Sometime after Hearst's death, she had begun talking into a tape recorder, setting down what she remembered of the whole extraordinary business: the castle, the guests, the pictures, the man. She never published it. She said she thought she had given away too much. The tapes were edited and issued after her death, and they remain the only place in the world where her own voice describes what happened to her, unmediated by anyone who wanted something from her. She died on the 22nd of September, 1961, in Hollywood. She was 64. According to some sources, The cause was cancer of the stomach. According to others, it was a malignant condition of the jaw, the illness she had refused to have operated on the previous summer. The two accounts appear side by side in the reference literature to this day. If any of you have access to documents that settle the question, leave a comment below. Shortly before the end, according to those who were with her, she called her husband over and told him she had no regrets. She was buried at Hollywood Forever, in the cemetery behind the studios, in a white marble mausoleum with the name Dowress on it, the name her family had abandoned in front of a property agent's signboard in Brooklyn, 60 years earlier. Millicent Hearst outlived her by 13 years. She had been a widow since 1951, and after the funeral, she went back to New York and resumed, without visible alteration, the life she had built there in 1926. There were the funds and the committees. There were the galas, fewer now, in a city where the kind of society she had spent 40 years mastering was quietly dissolving. There were summers on Long Island where her grandchildren came to stay for a fortnight at a time and remembered her decades later with real warmth. She was by then an institution of a vanished kind, a woman who had entered the century as a chorus girl in a musical comedy and was leaving it as the matriarch of one of the great American fortunes, having never once in 70 years of public life given an interview about the thing everybody wanted to ask her about. That silence is worth measuring. From the mid-1920s until her death, Millicent Hearst was one of the most photographed women in New York, married to the noisiest man in America, and living inside a domestic arrangement that every gossip columnist in the country would have paid a fortune to have her discuss. She never discussed it. Not once. Not in a memoir, not in a deathbed confidence, not in a single quotable remark that has survived. Whatever she thought of Marion Davies, she took it with her. She died at home in Manhattan on the 5th of December, 1974. She was 92 years old. She was buried at Woodlawn in the Bronx, a few miles from the streets where her father had once looked for work in the variety halls. Of the 5 sons she had raised through those campaigns, 3 were already gone before her. Her sons and their children inherited what their father had built, and the corporation that had nearly collapsed in the 1930s grew, across the second half of the century, into something considerably larger than anything he had run. At the height of the American newspaper age, one man decided each morning what the country would talk about. He is buried south of San Francisco in a hillside mausoleum next to his mother. His wife is buried in the Bronx. The woman he lived with for 34 years is buried in Hollywood, under a name he never gave her. 3,000 miles from him and 8 miles from the studio where she made her best pictures. It is possible to read the whole thing as a competition, and for most of a century that is exactly how it was read. The wronged wife and the other woman, the respectable one and the notorious one, the milk fund and the beach house. That reading requires almost nothing to be known about either of them, which is presumably why it lasted so long. What the documents show is something less satisfying and considerably more interesting. Both of them were girls from working New York who went onto a stage because their families needed the money. Both of them were noticed there by the same wealthy man 20 years apart at almost exactly the same age. Both of them built substantial charitable operations that kept poor children alive on opposite coasts at the same time without ever acknowledging that the other one existed. Both of them were defined for the rest of history by their relation to him, and both of them were, in their own right, considerably more capable than the men around them assumed. And both of them lost the same thing, which was the ordinary possibility of a settled life. Their afterlives have been unequal in a way that would probably have surprised both of them. Marion Davies has been slowly, painstakingly recovered. It took decades. The director who had done the damage spent his last years saying publicly that he had done it. Critics went back to the comedies of the late 20s and found, to their evident astonishment, a first-rate comic actress. Film archives restored the pictures. Biographers went into the papers and found the clinic in Sawtell, the $2 million given to a university hospital, the $1 million handed over in 1937, the astonishing decision to give back an empire. The house on the beach is a public facility now. Anyone can walk through the surviving guest wing and swim in her pool. Her name is on a children's clinic in a city where almost nobody recognizes it. She has become, At long last, the subject of her own story rather than a footnote in someone else's. Millicent Hearst has not been recovered because there is nothing to recover her from. She was never accused of anything. She was never caricatured in a masterpiece. She simply went on being respectable for 92 years and left no scandal, no memoir, and no quotable line. And the historical record treats her accordingly. A paragraph in her husband's entry, a photograph in a fundraising archive, a milk charity that fed poor children in New York for decades and is now remembered by nobody at all. There is a lesson in that about how history sorts women, and it is not a flattering one. The woman who was ruined is now studied. The woman who behaved impeccably has effectively disappeared. Millicent kept the name and spent half a century as the wife of a man who lived elsewhere. Marion kept the man and spent half a century being described in print as an accessory to his vanity, culminating in a masterpiece of the cinema that told the world she had no talent at all. He, meanwhile, had both of them, and appears to have been reasonably content with the arrangement for 25 years. There is no document recording a conversation between the two women. There may never have been one. What there is instead is a photograph from September 1929 of a poised woman in her 40s receiving a distinguished English visitor on the terrace of a castle above the Pacific, a house she did not build, could not keep, and had already, in every way that mattered, ceded to somebody else. She is smiling. She is entirely in command. She is standing in another woman's home, and everybody present, including her, knew it. Some rivalries in the end are remembered less for what the two women took from one another than for what neither of them was ever given.